Hello everybody, it's Wyron here with the first video in a tutorial series intended to focus solely on the quick match and tactical sort of aspect of Total War, Warhammer 2 and Mortal Empires and all that sort of stuff. I will be covering, in each of these videos, my intent is to cover a specific topic or a specific aspect of the tactical game. So this should be applicable in a quick match. I'm going to be trying to make this useful for custom games and even to an extent in campaign where the rules are a little different because it's kind of dumb. But hopefully this will give you guys these videos will serve to give you guys some ideas for tactical gameplay, perhaps give you guys some new inspiration, perhaps clarify some mechanics and that sort of stuff. And so for this first video I've decided to do something fairly simplistic, and that is what to look for when you're deciding what to do to mitigate enemy shooting. This is not assuming any fancy schmancy micro. You can obviously juke shooting to an extent. Obviously having smaller units is more useful. They're harder to hit for a lot of things, especially artillery pieces. So there's a bunch of little nitpicky things like that, but I just want to specifically focus on the differences between armor, shields, and missile resistance. And obviously, ideally, you have all three of these abilities. Ideally, you have great armor, great shields, and missile resistance. But that's usually not the case. So we'll kind of be discussing what is useful in what situations and that sort of stuff here. So first and foremost, we'll be going from the perspective of just a normal squad unit, whether this be cavalry or infantry. And then we'll touch upon slightly different rules, I think, when you're playing with monstrous units or large units. Because there are, I think, certain thing, the priorities there might be a little somewhat different than when you're utilizing normal small squad units. So first and foremost, just armor, the most simplistic of protection. Armor mitigates non-normal damage, non-armor piercing damage, by a value between the maximum armor value, by percentage between the maximum armor value and 50% of that armor value. So in the case of the silver helms here, they're reducing all incoming damage, normal damage, by 45 to 90%. So for example, when we look at our good old Quarreler friends here, their missile damage is 16 normal and 4 armor piercing. That means that 4 armor piercing is always going to go through, and then the remaining missile damage is being reduced by 45 to 90%, the remaining 16, which does mean that you're getting hit for anywhere between about 9 damage and 1 damage from the remaining missile damage. So you're always going to be, with the silver helms in this situation, you're always going to be hit for at least 4, really at least 5 damage. And so that is important to keep in mind. Now armor can get 100% damage resistance, though I do believe one point of damage does always have to go through from the normal damage, so I don't believe you can become completely invulnerable. But obviously units like the steam tank or the silver helms, or not silver helms, but obviously units like the steam tank or other situations can easily get a consistent 100% armor save. A lot of the higher end cavalry has over 100 armor, so they can get over 100% armor save fairly consistently. Some of the important things to keep in mind is that while armor is limited to only countering normal damage, armor also has a 360-degree effect. It isn't limited in arc. It works, of course, against all damage, but since we're only discussing missiles here, that's important. That's the only thing we're focusing on, and it works against all forms of damage, whether melee or ranged. It also works against explosive damage, though, which is important to keep in mind, since a lot of ranged units, especially artillery pieces, as well as, say, explosives in the form of grenade launchers from Outriders or blasting charges, those sorts of attacks will hit you no matter what, but the armor will still reduce the non-armor piercing values of those attacks. This can also be useful against, say, units like Doomdiver catapults, who have fairly weak and non-armor piercing splash for most part. So armor can actually be pretty helpful against those sorts of units. Since a lot of artillery, though generally wiping out whatever direct hits, does lose splash, and you can mitigate that splash through armor. So armor is generally good simply against non-armor piercing damage, and for 360 protection, and basically against all forms of damage, but obviously non-armor piercing. Then we go on the shields. Shields are a flat ward save, and the ward save can be, there are 3 types of shields you can have. Well, there are 3 colors of shields. You can have bronze, silver, and gold. I'm not entirely sure what the point where it switches from silver to gold is. I do believe silver is over 50% shield value. Gold, I've only seen it a few times when abilities are procced. If it's a unit that has a baseline silver shield, sometimes you can get it over, say, towards 75 or over 75, towards 80% shield value with certain abilities and items. And then you get a gold shield. Regardless, the main shields you will usually see are bronze and silver. And the way the shield works is it mitigates all small arms fire coming in from the frontal arc by whatever percentage the shield is, or it blocks a certain amount of projectiles, but with whatever percentage is provided here. So for example, in this case, 20% of all projectiles from small arms are going to be blocked. So all the shots these squirrels are firing, 20% are just, or on average, are going to be blocked. Now of course, this is an average. This is not a constant. In some situations, you might get lucky with your RNG and block every single shot. In some cases, you might get extremely unlucky and not block any shots. It's an RNG roll for an absolute 100% save, essentially, against small arms. Now, the problem with shields is they're limited in arc. They only cover your frontal arc, and they are also, they get ignored by explosives, blasting charges, all that sort of stuff. None of those are affected by shields. Generally, shields are best if you're just simply trying to mitigate, say, armor-piercing damage, especially armor-piercing damage, on your way into the fray. Obviously, if your units are lightly armored, then it's good against normal damage. They're just good for cutting down enemy fire as you're gap closing. Otherwise, if it's a unit that's, for example, flanking more, like cavalry, shields might be less important because you're often taking fire in the flank. If it's a unit that's just a flanking unit in general, oftentimes shields are not as important. Or if you suspect your opponent is bringing, or if you know in the case of AI, you might know that your opponent is bringing a lot of explosive damage, shields are not really going to help you. But they do mitigate all forms of damage by a certain RNG roll percentage. Finally, missile resistance, which is probably the best of the bunch. It's simply a flat, constant damage reduction of whatever percentage is set. In this case, you have 30%. In the case of, say, the Chameleon Skanks, it's 40%. In the case of Tyrion, it's 15%. Now, missile resistance doesn't get bypassed by anything from the range perspective. Explosive damage, magic damage, fire damage, none of that matters. None of it bypasses. It's not like physical resistance, for example. It's not like physical resistance or magic resistance or whatever. Everything is reduced by whatever amount is set. So in this case, it's 30%, and AP damage is also reduced by that value. So these quarrelers with their 16 and 4 damage split are, I don't know how that averages, the rounding is done in this game, but they'll be hitting for around 11. They'll be reduced to about 11 normal damage, and their missile damage will be reduced to about 2 to 3, depending on how the rounding is done. 10 to 11 missile and 2 to 3 armor piercing. So that's just one of the important things I think to keep in mind. It's that missile resistance, and it's a constant, it's consistent, it's always going to be 30% of whatever hits you. It works against explosives. In my opinion, it's one of the better abilities as well for large units, since if your opponent is expecting you to bring monsters, generally most monsters are susceptible to AP. In my opinion, if you can get your monsters with high missile resistances, for example, Kolek definitely benefits a lot from his high missile or fairly high missile resistance. It lets you, in certain cases, it can allow your skirmishers to win out, such as the cases of Chameleon Skanks against enemy skirmishers. It can be incredibly useful. It's just a great sort of mitigating tool. The only thing it doesn't help against, of course, is just straight up blocking damage, which means the damage distribution will be slightly different, but it does provide 360 protection and all that sort of stuff. So in general, I would definitely classify it as superior to shields, and generally superior to armor, though, because the values for your missile resistance are generally nowhere near as high as the values can be for armor. The best armor values are usually will provide more protection against non-armor piercing weaponry than missile resistance will. So for example, in this situation I don't have Thunders here, but let's say the Thunders are doing 10 armor piercing damage and 2 normal, then the 90% is only mitigating the normal damage by the normal damage is going to be 1 no matter what, and the armor piercing is 10 every time, whereas in this situation these guys will be mitigating probably the normal damage by 30%, which is going to drop it down to 1, I'm assuming, with the rounding, and the 10 will be reduced down to 7 by the 30%. So it'll actually, missile resistance will provide these guys greater protection than what the silver helms here are experiencing against armor piercing of that sort. So just a little tidbit there. And I do hope you guys find that useful. Basically, in short, armor and missile resistance are good against every sort of shooting from all angles, well, missile resistance is good against all sorts of shooting. It's probably the best. It's good from all angles. It mitigates all forms of damage, no matter what type they come in, and it's just useful. It just tends to have lower values. Shields mitigate shooting frontally. They're fairly limited in their aspect, but they can definitely cut down very heavily on the amount of damage you're taking on your initial rush to your opponent. They're very good on units intended to face tank and soak up enemy fire. For example, goblins with silver shields are incredibly good at soaking up enemy fire. Finally, in the situation of armor, armor is of course only functional against normal damage, but if you're going up against an opponent with very low armor piercing values on the most of their shooting, such as orcs, Bretonia, or the beastmen with their Ungor raiders, or even the high elves with their Lothern Seaguard and that sort of stuff, you can actually have high armor will actually be more valuable for you than missile resistance or shields in a lot of situations, which is just something to keep in mind. Of course, physical resistance, ward saves, all that sort of stuff can function just like missile resistance. It is important to keep in mind, of course, that physical resistance can be bypassed by magical arrows or magical projectiles like silver bullets. Similarly, of course, normal damage, if you have magic resistance, it's not normal damage is going to go through. And do keep in mind that resistances do stack. So for example, if you had, in some cases you'll have heroes who have high armor, missile resistance, and shields, then you can cut down on the incoming fire damage, or incoming damage from enemy fire, by a huge amount, potentially. So just something to keep in mind, I think. Resistance is also stacked, so for example, Iron Drakes are practically immune to Starfire Shafts because they have both a fire and a magical resistance. So just some of those little things to keep in mind. If you have missile resistance stacked on top of physical resistance, something like that, you can often get this through spells. It's just good. You can stack, of course, shields and missile resistance stack on top of each other, that sort of stuff. So I hope you guys first found this useful for explaining to you what is the optimal protection against each different type of damage, or the different types of damage you can expect. Missile resistance just generally the best against everything. Shields the best for gap closing against normal infantry projectiles, and armor is generally good against low armor piercing values, and against low armor piercing values and explosives after skirmish, after missile resistance. So once again, I do hope you guys found this useful. If you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe down below, and leave any comments, criticism, any additional input you'd like to share, any comments on how I can make this sort of tutorial better. I'm trying to make this short. I do believe this one was already a little longer than I intended, but I'm trying to make it a bit complete as far as covering each topic I'm doing, or as far as making sure the topic I'm covering is well, I'm rounding everything out and kind of covering all aspects. So I do hope you guys found it useful. Yeah, if you did, be sure to leave a like, subscribe down below, and leave any comments, criticism, anything like that. I intend to keep going with this series, especially as I'm still kind of waiting for all the updates to finish up for Mortal Empires. And I kind of want to wait for the reprisal upgrade date for Empire or for the old world factions to all be brought up to date. Obviously, Norska's not supposed to come out for several months just yet, so I don't want to go into that too early, but this will be kind of a tutorial I'll be focusing on, and hopefully it can help you guys out as well, and you guys will find it useful, this sort of tutorial series. And that's about it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. I do appreciate you all for watching this, and be sure to leave me with your thoughts and comments, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.